Sophocles' Antigone ends with the tragic deaths of three of its main characters, but the play's last lines are about happiness. The events of the play create a tragic narrative, and yet the chorus, the deliverers of the last lines, seems to think that these events have given insight onto how to achieve happiness. The chorus sees that out of all the misery, heartbreak, and suicide that has occurred in Thebes under Creon's rule, there has been a positive consequence. Creon has gained wisdom, and wisdom, it is also believed by the chorus, is no small benefit. To use their words, it is the crown of happiness. Creon, through his own folly and the punishment of the gods, has during the last minutes of the play gained wisdom, and with wisdom, happiness. But in these last minutes, Creon has also only begun to experience the grief and horror of the deaths of his son, his wife, and his niece, for all of whose deaths he shares guilt, and so he must also feel misery. The words of the chorus and the character's development seem to communicate two contradictory results for Creon. One, that he now wears the crown of happiness, and the other, that he is in a gauntlet of guilt, grief, and pain. After holding his dead son in his arms and seeing the corpse of his wife, Creon cries, "What further agony has fate in store? I can endure no more." The loss of his family has lowered Creon to a state in which he can barely live. He has come to a breaking point. He can endure no more. He believes he has reached the limit of agony that he can bear, and it is at this moment of being forced to bear what is unbearable, of complete brokenness, that a messenger arrives to deliver word to Creon that his wife has died. And not only has she died, she has killed herself because of him. Before killing herself, Eurydice burdened Creon with guilt, charging him with the deaths of both his sons. Creon, who has already claimed he cannot bear any more, now hears the words his own wife spoke before tying a noose around her neck. He hears the sentiments from a woman who bore his children, "Blame him for the deaths of those children, they rose together." Only hearing this kind of accusation would be torture enough for any man, but to also accept the validity of it. Surely the kind of man who does this is in a most wretched state. Creon confesses, "I am guilty, only I. Nothing is left except to die." Whether this statement means he will kill himself, or only that he no longer has any motivation to live, either interpretation shows that at the end of Antigone, Creon is miserable. The crown of happiness is to be wise, honor the gods, and the gods' edicts prize. They strike down boastful men, and men grown bold. Wisdom we learn at last when we are old. The final lines of Antigone, spoken by the chorus, who pose perhaps a different definition of happiness to the one most of us are used to: having wisdom. The wisdom they speak of is not so much an active acquisition of knowledge as it is a passive acceptance of the way the world works, and they credit this way things are to the will of their gods. The middle two sentences of the chorus's final quote explain what it is to be wise, which is in essence to subjugate yourself to the gods, honoring them as superior and accepting their laws as above any created by men. The chorus also says to Creon, men must accept their doom. These two quotes from the chorus considered, their message is that a wise man accepts that the gods control fate. They control the laws that govern how one ought to behave, and they have the power and will to punish anyone who would go against their desires for the future and their laws. In other words, the chorus wrap up the play with the message that one is wise once he understands his place in the world. While the first two lines explain what wisdom is, the last two explain how people gain it. A chorus of elders telling a younger man that we all learn wisdom when we are old might at first sound like a group of old men who have a bit of a bias towards being old, but they are not saying the instrument with which wisdom is gained is old age. Old age is just the time in one's life when one gains it. The instrument is the experience of living and gaining an understanding of what kinds of actions are punished by the gods and what kinds are rewarded. Having one's life destroyed turns a boastful man into a wise one, as through the destruction he comes to understand his inferiority in power in relation to the gods, and he realizes that his actions were deemed by this higher power as worthy of punishment. The idea I think the chorus are getting at is that at the time of old age, one has lived enough to have an adequate sample size of memories to look at and say, here were my actions, and here were my spells of good or bad fortune in life. Now I can determine what I did that aligned with the gods' edicts and what I did that went against them. Though Antigone follows the gods' will and Creon does not, neither is wise at the time of their actions. They are both doing what they think is right. It is only Creon who becomes wise because he reaches the age in which he can process what has happened and how the gods have responded to it. It is from the perspective of old age that Creon can understand clearly whose side the gods were on in the disagreement between him and Antigone. Creon acts in most of the play as exactly this kind of boastful man described by the elders. He is boastful not in the fact that he believes himself above the gods and their laws. He is genuinely convinced that the gods would agree with him, as he tells Antigone, not even in the underworld is a friend a foe. Never is it right for the just and unjust to be considered equals. That is, Creon thinks, an eternal, and in being eternal, a divine law. Eteocles, in his eyes, is the just defender of Thebes, and Polynices the unjust traitor and agitator. He is boastful not because he did not desire to adhere to the gods' edicts. He is boastful simply because he abides by his own, and his own laws, he discovers far too late, do not align with the gods. He sentences Antigone to death for breaking an edict, but the chorus rightly states that in Thebes, Creon's will, not the gods' will, is law. We find out, just as Creon does, at the end of all the actions and spells of fortune in the play, that Creon acted in disagreement with the gods' edicts, and Antigone was right when she says she follows the laws of heaven. If Creon has a fatal flaw in the play, it is misjudgment, and when he disagrees with that statement of Antigone's, that she is following the laws of heaven, it is a misjudgment of disastrous proportion. He has not prized the gods' edicts, and for this, he is struck down emphatically. The gods destroy Creon to the breaking point and beyond, but having been struck down, Creon has at last learned wisdom. He says to the elders, "My folly slew my wife, my son. Lead me away, brought low, undone." In response to this expression of misery, the elders describe the crown of happiness. The undone man is their example of the wise one. Even though what he once prized has been utterly destroyed and taken away from him, he has gained an understanding of his place in the world, and in doing so, according to the chorus, he is happy. I say this as a paradox because through all of Creon's final quotes, he radiates misery. Yet the final message of the play is that Creon is happy. The happiness described by Sophocles' chorus does not seem to be the same as Aristotle's eudaimonia. That is an active experience of flourishing. When Creon achieves happiness in the eyes of the chorus, he is actively experiencing misery. Perhaps, then, happiness is not this thing we think of it as. Smiling, laughing, having fun. We might be better off thinking of happiness as an achieved perspective and high level of understanding what the will of the gods is or was in a given circumstance. If we think of it in this way, then the emotions of Creon are no longer paradoxical. He feels misery. He has gained happiness.